China just won a war. America thought it was fighting at 2:47 in the morning. Donald Trump posted a celebration on Truth Social, the ceasefire, the deal, the win. Pakistan's prime minister had just announced it on global television. The cameras were rolling, the handshakes were happening, and Trump was telling the world he had done it. He had not done it. 6 days ago, on April 15th, at approximately 9:15 in the morning Beijing time, an Iranian diplomatic delegation boarded a China Eastern flight out of Tehran's Imam Khomeini Airport. The destination was not publicly announced. The meeting was not on any published diplomatic calendar. It was the fifth such secret trip since the war began on February 28th. Not one of those trips was announced by Tehran. Not one was confirmed by Beijing. And yet every single one of them was the actual spine of the ceasefire that Donald Trump is still calling his personal achievement. Tonight, I am going to tell you the story Washington does not want told. The ceasefire of April 8th was not brokered in Islamabad. It was brokered in a series of closed rooms in Beijing through a pressure campaign directed at Tehran by a Chinese state that had decided, weeks before anyone else understood what was happening, that this war was going to end on terms China could live with, or it was going to take the global economy down with it. And Beijing was not willing to allow the second outcome. This is not a story about who gets credit. This is a story about who actually has leverage. And for the first time in decades in the Persian Gulf, the answer is not the United States. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the pipeline of money that sits underneath everything. For the last 5 years, China has been the single largest buyer of Iranian crude oil. Not by a small margin, by an overwhelming one. According to estimates from ship tracking firms, China has been absorbing between 85 and 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil exports, typically at a discount of $12 to $18 per barrel below the global benchmark. Those barrels do not show up in China's official customs data. They arrive through what the industry calls the dark fleet, ship-to-ship transfers in the Gulf of Oman and the South China Sea, labeled as Malaysian or Omani crude by the time they reach the refineries in Shandong province. But they are Iranian, and they are the single most important revenue stream the Islamic Republic has. Before the war began, this trade was moving roughly 1.6 million barrels a day. That is the number that pays Iranian government salaries. That is the number that funds the Revolutionary Guard. That is the number that keeps the Iranian treasury from collapse in a country where official inflation is already above 40%. On March 12th, 2 weeks into the war, that number stopped. Not gradually, not a slow taper. It stopped. Chinese state refiners and private operators who had been processing Iranian barrels for years under plausible deniability all received what the Financial Times would later describe as informal guidance from China's National Development and Reform Commission. 2 instructions: pause new Iranian crude contracts. Do not accept cargoes that cannot demonstrate clean passage through a secured shipping route. The effect was instant. Within 72 hours, Iranian oil exports to China collapsed from 1.6 million barrels a day to under 300,000. And the Iranian treasury, which had been running on a knife's edge for months, lost roughly 90% of its single largest revenue stream at the exact moment that wartime spending was spiking to record levels. Beijing did not hold a press conference about this. There was no foreign ministry statement. The Chinese government did not tell the world it had cut off Iranian oil purchases. It simply stopped buying them. And it let Tehran figure out over the course of 72 hours of increasingly panicked phone calls that the money had stopped flowing. That is how China communicates with Iran, not through statements, through invoices, or in this case, through the absence of them. By March 17th, according to Bloomberg source to a senior Iranian economic official, President Pezeshkian had convened an emergency session of the Supreme National Security Council. The agenda was not military strategy. It was not missile inventory. It was not how to respond to American strikes. The agenda was a single question. How does the Iranian state continue to function if Chinese oil purchases do not resume within 30 days? The answer, according to the economic advisors who briefed that meeting, was that it does not. Iran's foreign exchange reserves were estimated at roughly 6 weeks of minimum government function, the ordinary machinery of state. pensions, salaries, food subsidies, import letters of credit. That entire apparatus was 6 weeks away from a cliff. That was the pressure. Not the American carrier strike group, not the Israeli missile defense layers, not Trump's threat that a civilization would die. The pressure that actually brought Iran to the ceasefire table on April 8th was a quiet, unannounced decision by a foreign ministry in Beijing to stop a flow of money that Iran cannot survive without. And here is why that pressure worked when American military pressure had not. Iran had been planning for American military pressure for 45 years. Every element of the Islamic Republic's strategic doctrine, the proxy networks, the underground enrichment facilities, the missile production capacity, the deliberate design of regime survival as the supreme national interest, had been built around the assumption that the primary external threat would be kinetic: bombs, missiles, cyber attacks, assassinations. Iran had absorbed the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. It had absorbed the Natanz sabotage. It had absorbed the killing of nuclear scientists on the streets of Tehran. And the regime had not broken. That was not an accident. That was the product of 4 decades of institutional design. What Iran had not designed for was the sudden withdrawal of its one reliable economic lifeline by the state that had spent the previous decade presenting itself as Iran's strategic counterweight against the West. Beijing's pause was not just a financial blow, it was a psychological rupture. It told the Iranian leadership that the strategic partnership they had been building with China, the one ceremonialized in the 25-year agreement signed in 2021, deepened through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS expansion, was not the unconditional backstop they had assumed. It was conditional, and the conditions had just been applied. That rupture is what broke the Iranian position, not American missiles, a Chinese invoice. But Beijing did not just pull the lever. Beijing told Tehran exactly what needed to happen for the lever to be pushed back. According to reporting from Nikkei Asia, partially confirmed by a senior European diplomat, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a 90-minute phone call with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on March 24th. The call was not reported publicly by either government. What Wang Yi communicated, according to the reporting, was a framework. China would resume oil purchases. Chinese financial institutions would quietly extend emergency credit facilities. Chinese state firms would commit to accelerated infrastructure investment in Iran's post-war reconstruction. All of that was on the table. But it was conditional. The conditions were specific. First, Iran would accept a ceasefire framework that did not require the United States to withdraw from the Gulf as a precondition. Second, Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial traffic within a defined timeline. Third, Iran would agree to a verifiable cessation of attacks on Gulf state oil infrastructure. And fourth, and this is the condition that almost nobody has reported correctly, Iran would allow a Chinese backchannel to run in parallel to the Pakistani mediation track, giving Beijing a direct seat at the negotiations rather than operating through Islamabad. The first 3 conditions were things Iran could do. The fourth was the one that mattered, because what Wang Yi was telling Araghchi, in the diplomatic language both of them understood perfectly, was this: China was prepared to underwrite the cost of Iran ending the war. But the underwriting came with the expectation that China, not Pakistan and certainly not the United States, would be sitting at the center of whatever framework emerged on the other side. Iran accepted that framework on March 27th. But the acceptance was not simple. President Pezeshkian did not have the authority on his own to accept the Chinese framework. He needed the approval of Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man killed in the opening strikes of the war, a figure whose legitimacy among the Revolutionary Guard and the hardline clerical establishment was still being consolidated. The IRGC chief Ahmad Vahidi reportedly opposed the framework on the grounds that it represented a strategic capitulation disguised as a settlement. The argument inside the Supreme National Security Council lasted, by one account, the better part of 72 hours. Pezeshkian prevailed, but he prevailed by showing the Supreme Leader a single document, a Chinese financial projection showing what would happen to the Iranian economy within 60 days if Beijing's pause on oil purchases became permanent. The Supreme Leader approved the framework that night. The ceasefire announcement followed 11 days later. The ceasefire that Pakistan's Prime Minister announced to global cameras on April 8th, the one Trump celebrated at 2:47 in the morning, did not include unconditional surrender. It did not include the dismantling of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. It did not include the withdrawal of Iranian support for regional proxy networks. It did not include reparations to Israel. It did not include any of the maximalist demands Trump had laid out on March 6th. Instead, it included a phased reopening of the Strait of Hormuz tied to mutual de-escalation in Lebanon, a framework for resumed nuclear talks with specific timelines, but no preconditions on enrichment capacity, and critically, a clause about the eventual reduction of U.S. combat presence in the region as a confidence-building measure. The architecture of the deal was Chinese. The delivery mechanism was Pakistani. The branding was American. And that mismatch between who controlled the substance and who received the public credit is the single biggest reason the ceasefire has unraveled the way it has. When the American delegation arrived in Islamabad on April 10th, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance as the senior political principal, they discovered something Trump's team had not fully absorbed. The Iranians had already committed in writing to a set of positions that assumed a reduced American regional footprint. When Vance and Rubio pushed back on that clause, when they tried to renegotiate it out of the framework, the Iranian delegation did something that delegations in Iranian negotiations almost never do. They produced documentation of prior agreement. That documentation did not reference Washington. It did not reference Pakistan. According to reporting that has emerged through European sources since the talks collapsed, the documentation referenced Beijing. And the Iranian position was that those terms had already been agreed, were not renegotiable, and that any attempt to strip them from the framework would be interpreted as an American decision to walk away from the ceasefire itself. That is the moment J.D. Vance understood what had actually happened. Not that Iran had capitulated, not that Trump's threats had worked, but that China had used the 6-week window of the war to establish itself as the shadow guarantor of the outcome, and that the ceasefire Trump was celebrating was effectively a Chinese document with a Pakistani stamp on it. The talks collapsed the next day. Trump's response tells you everything about a president now operating without the leverage he thought he had. Within 24 hours of Vance announcing the collapse, Trump ordered a full naval blockade of all Iranian ports. The blockade was not a strategic decision rooted in a revised theory of compellence. It was a reflexive escalation by a president who had just been told, in effect, that the outcome of his war was being shaped in a language he does not speak, by a government he cannot coerce, using financial instruments that the United States Treasury has no direct authority over. Secretary of State Rubio, who had spent 2 days in Islamabad watching the Chinese framework assert itself into the American negotiating position, reportedly argued against the blockade on the grounds that a blockade the United States could not fully enforce against Chinese-linked shipping would generate more humiliation than leverage. Vance sided with Hegseth. Trump signed the order roughly 9 hours after the collapse was communicated to the press. According to one European diplomat speaking on background, that sequence was the moment the American government stopped operating from a coherent strategy and started operating from a series of reflexes. 5 days into that blockade, the evidence that Trump's escalation has deepened Chinese leverage rather than diminished it is everywhere, if you know where to look. Since the blockade took effect on April 13th, Iranian oil exports have not collapsed. They have shifted. Panamanian-flagged tankers carrying Iranian crude are now routing to the Pakistani port of Gwadar, operated under a long-term lease by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. Once there, the cargoes are transferred onto vessels that continue east to refineries in Shandong province. The dark fleet operation that China paused in March has been reactivated, except now it is operating under the legal cover of a Pakistani port that the United States cannot strike without triggering a crisis with a nuclear-armed state that sits on the Chinese border. The volume numbers are telling. During the peak of the war, Iranian crude exports averaged roughly 400,000 barrels a day. By April 16th, 3 days after the blockade began, that figure had climbed back to roughly 900,000, still below pre-war levels, but the trajectory is upward, and the United States Navy, which has the physical capacity to interdict those cargoes, has chosen not to, because interdicting a Panamanian-flagged vessel destined for a Chinese-operated port in Pakistan is not a naval operation. It is an act of war against Beijing and Islamabad simultaneously, and nobody in the White House, including Trump, is ready to take that step. The blockade is working in the sense that it is visible, loud, and declared. It is not working in the sense that it is doing the thing a blockade is supposed to do, which is cut off the adversary's economy. Look at what China has done publicly since the blockade began. On April 14th, Wang Yi used a phrase that Chinese diplomats almost never use. He called the blockade a coercive measure that violates the principle of freedom of navigation in international waters. Those are not throwaway words. That is the Chinese Foreign Ministry using the same legal framework, freedom of navigation, that the United States has used for decades to justify its naval presence in the South China Sea, turned directly against the United States. The American press barely covered it. On April 15th, the People's Bank of China announced a new bilateral settlement mechanism with the Central Bank of Iran for trade denominated in yuan. That announcement was framed as routine. It is not routine. It is a formal upgrade of the financial plumbing that allows Iran to conduct international trade entirely outside the dollar system, announced while a U.S. naval blockade was actively trying to squeeze the Iranian economy. The timing was a signal. On April 16th, Xi Jinping made a phone call to Vladimir Putin. According to the Chinese state readout of that call, the two leaders discussed, and I am paraphrasing the translation carefully, the necessity of a durable multilateral framework for Persian Gulf security that reflects the interests of regional states rather than external powers. Translated from diplomatic Mandarin, that sentence means this: China and Russia are about to propose an alternative security architecture for the Gulf that does not include the United States as a central pillar. These are not independent events. They are the components of a coordinated Chinese response to an American naval operation that Beijing correctly assessed as a sign of weakness rather than strength. Beijing is not reacting defensively. Beijing is pressing. The reason China can press is that China has something Trump does not have in this war: the ability to offer Iran a path forward that does not require Iranian surrender. American strategy in the Gulf has been built for 40 years on a binary. Iran submits or Iran suffers. Chinese strategy does not operate on that binary. Chinese strategy says Iran stays Iran, keeps its government, keeps its nuclear program under negotiated constraints, and joins a regional framework in which Chinese capital is the primary external investor and Chinese diplomacy is the primary external mediator. From Tehran's perspective, that is not a concession. That is a survival strategy, and it is why Beijing has leverage that Washington does not. Now, let me give you the three scenarios because this story is still moving, and the next 72 hours will tell you which direction it goes. Scenario 1. Trump escalates to save the appearance of control. The blockade is not enough. The Chinese bypass through Gwadar continues to widen. The president, facing a Republican base that was promised unconditional surrender and is now watching a negotiated framework emerge that looks like anything but, orders a direct military action to reset the terms. That could mean strikes on Iranian oil export infrastructure beyond the scope of the original operation. It could mean a move against Chinese-linked vessels in the Indian Ocean. It could mean a public rejection of the existing ceasefire framework and a declaration of new demands. Any of those moves would be the act of a president who has realized he is not in control of his own war and is willing to break the framework rather than accept that reality. The primary risk in this scenario is not a wider war, though that is a secondary risk. The primary risk is that such an escalation forces China to choose between further diplomatic pressure and direct material support for Iran. If that choice is forced, the economic and strategic consequences for the United States are orders of magnitude larger than anything the blockade was designed to achieve. Scenario 2. The Chinese framework quietly absorbs the collapse of the Islamabad talks. The blockade continues to be declared but not effectively enforced against Chinese-linked shipping. Iranian oil exports gradually rebuild through the Gwadar Channel. A new set of negotiations opens, possibly in Beijing, possibly in Muscat, but not in Islamabad, and not with the United States in the lead chair. Over the next 4 to 6 weeks, a revised ceasefire framework emerges that looks substantively similar to the April 8th Chinese brokered document, but is presented publicly as a multilateral diplomatic achievement. Trump is offered a face-saving role in the announcement. He takes it because the alternative is admitting that the war ended on terms he did not set. The United States exits this war with its military reputation intact, but its regional influence permanently reduced. This is the likeliest scenario as of tonight. Scenario 3, American withdrawal. The pressure of maintaining a blockade that is not working, combined with the economic cost of sustained $100 oil, combined with allied opposition from Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others, combined with a midterm election cycle in which Republican incumbents must answer for why a war that was supposed to end in unconditional surrender has instead produced a Chinese brokered framework and a regional realignment. All of those forces combine to produce a decision in Washington to accept a managed exit. The blockade is lifted. The American military presence in the Gulf is reduced to pre-war levels. The ceasefire framework that China actually authored becomes the operative document. This scenario does not require any formal American acknowledgement of Chinese success. It simply requires the quiet acceptance that the alternative is worse. I do not know which of these three scenarios plays out. Nobody does, but I know which one China is preparing for. And I know which one Trump is trying to prevent. And the gap between those two is the space in which the next phase is going to be decided. Let me close with the thing that I think most people following this war need to hear clearly. The real story of this conflict is not a story about American military power. American military power is real. It is overwhelming. It did what it was designed to do in the first 72 hours. But military power is not the same thing as political control. And political control is not the same thing as strategic leverage. China understood this at the start of the war in a way that the White House did not. China understood that a conflict of this scale in this region with this degree of global economic exposure was going to produce a settlement whether Washington wanted one or not. And China positioned itself through the quiet mechanism of oil purchases and the unannounced lever of financial settlement infrastructure to be the indispensable actor in producing that settlement. Trump thought he was running the war. He was running one dimension of it, the kinetic dimension, the missiles and the aircraft carriers and the midnight social media posts. But the other dimension, the one that actually decides what settlement emerges on the far side of the fighting, was being run out of Beijing the entire time. And it is being run out of Beijing right now. The Iranian delegation that boarded that China Eastern flight 6 days ago was not flying to a negotiation. They were flying to a review meeting. A meeting in which the terms of a ceasefire that has already been agreed are being translated into the terms of a post-war regional order, and the United States is not in the room. That is what it looks like when a superpower loses control of its own war. Not defeat on the battlefield, not withdrawal under fire, but the quiet, unmistakable discovery that the outcome you thought you were dictating is being dictated to you by the one country you spent the last decade telling your own voters was your primary strategic adversary. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender. There is now a deal. It is not unconditional. And the surrender in this story, if there is one, is not the one being handed from Tehran to Washington. It is the one being handed from Washington to Beijing through a document that an American president is still calling a victory because the alternative is telling the truth about what just happened. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next phase. And the next phase is going to look very different from what Trump announced on March 6th. If you want to understand what happens next, not the press conference version, but the actual architecture of the deals being made, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next 72 hours are going to determine which scenario plays out. The pace of information is only going to accelerate, and when it moves, we will be here before the headlines catch up. In the next video, we go inside the Gwadar operation. The Pakistani port at the center of the new oil route is not an accident. It is the physical infrastructure of a Chinese strategy that was built years before this war began. A strategy whose full dimensions are only now becoming visible. If you want to understand where the leverage goes after this ceasefire, you need to understand what China built in Pakistan and why? That is the next video. Stay with this, because what happens next is not going to wait for Washington to catch up.